Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Jessica Zavala, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health to today's webinar, Revitalizing Our Exhausted Brains, a Mental Bandwidth Perspective. Before I introduce the presenter today, I do have a few brief announcements to share. First and foremost, CME and CEU credits are available. The activity code for today's session is 99MISS. Again, that is 99MIST. This code will expire on tomorrow, April 21st at 12 p.m. So please be on the lookout for information via the chat on how to obtain credits. Next, we invite you to join us for our next webinar on May 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as Dr. Malika Brown, who is a specialist in traumatology from Pasadena City College and Citrus College, will present on the overachievement syndrome and how it can lead to an increase in depression, anxiety, and suicidality. Also, registration is now open for the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health Conference, Reimagining Campus Community Partnerships. That conference will take place on May 18th at Quest Conference Center in Columbus, Ohio. So we will be really excited if you could join us. You may find additional details regarding the conference and upcoming events on our website and, of course, social media. Today's webinar will be interactive, and we encourage you to post your questions or comments in the Q&A and or chat box. And finally, this webinar will be recorded and the video will be made available for viewing on our YouTube channel. And now to introduce our presenter, Dr. Tina Bhargava is an associate professor at Kent State University, our neighbor, and a thought leader in applying dual process theories of cognition with a focus on mental bandwidth to improving effectiveness and increasing equity in health services, workplaces, higher education, and everyday life. She completed her undergraduate and master's degrees at Stanford University and formally began her scholarly work on mental bandwidth during her doctoral studies in public health at the University of Pittsburgh. And so without further ado, we are really excited to welcome today Dr. Tina Bhargava.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's wonderful to be here. Let me get my slides going. And I saw a couple of familiar names there, which is always nice to know I've got a couple of people out there. And I'm looking forward to sharing this material with all you guys. I'm going to be talking about revitalizing our exhausted brains. I don't know about you, my brain is tired. It's been a time, and it still is a time. And I'm going to be talking today a little bit about why our brains are so tired and what we can do about it. A couple of things for today. I'm going to be using Poll Everywhere. I don't know if you've used Poll Everywhere before, but it's a way to interact with me. So I'll ask you a couple of questions where there are more poll answers, but also there'll be an opportunity for you to type answers in. So you can join it in two ways. You can go to pollev.com if you're on a computer, enter the word bandwidth, or you can text the word bandwidth to 37607. Either of those will help you to get connected to the Poll Everywhere for today. We'll also be using the chat feature in Zoom. So if you click on the chat window, where you've been able to see the announcement so far, you can go ahead and put your comments in there, and I'll be giving you a chance to practice that in a minute. And you can also raise your hand from the participant panel. So if there's any times that I'm like, hey, raise your hand if, and then you can go ahead and do that. So I will be interacting with you guys today. I'll be asking you to interact with me. I won't be asking you to share your videos, so you don't need to worry about fixing your hair or anything if you are worried about that. We'll just be interacting through Poll Everywhere and through the chat feature in Zoom. Hopefully you've had a chance to join the poll everywhere. The instructions will come up when I actually do a poll everywhere question, which I'm going to do right now. So here is the first activity on poll everywhere, in one word, or you can hyphenate 2 words so they stay together. What is on your mind right now? Okay, so what is on your mind right now? I'm assuming that meant lunch. Yep. Planning, committees, you're thirsty. Yeah, I'm kind of thirsty myself. Um, Everything, end of semester, grief, okay, work, um, headache. Sorry to hear that. Civil unrest. Yes, there's a lot going on in the world right now. Um, Deadlines. So this is a word cloud. So the more a response comes up, the bigger the word is in the word cloud. Yeah, I'm with you guys. There's a lot on my mind as well. Um, there's so much going on in the world, in our lives. Um, yeah. Thank you for sharing some of those things. That's good for me to know. And we'll be talking a little bit about what do we do about all the things on our mind in our session today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. First, I'll tell you about my professional background. So you know how I got to study about mental bandwidth. I did my undergraduate and my master's studies at Stanford University. My undergraduate major was human biology, which is actually a really unique major at Stanford. It's a little bit like public health, actually. It's like how humans and biology interact. So it's biology, and then it's public policy and anthropology and sociology and psychology. And you get a little bit of everything and talk about how they interact with each other. Um, I did my master's in education, in curriculum studies and teacher education. My original plan was to be a high school science teacher, and then I talked to a whole bunch of high school science teachers, and I figured out that's probably not what I really wanted to do. I really wanted to teach in creative ways and the kind of content that a lot of people didn't teach. And it was clear pretty quickly that that's not the opportunity to get in high school. So I decided to teach in college instead, which I love. My doctoral program was at the University of Pittsburgh. I worked at the Center for Research on Healthcare while I was there. And actually, I worked on these big studies, mostly funded by the Department of Defense, looking at diabetes prevention. So there's a well-established diabetes prevention program. Maybe some of you have heard of it, the DPP. And we were looking at how do we make it more accessible to more people. So we were putting it online and testing out how can we do this program online to get it out to more people. And that was when I really started thinking about bandwidth, because I was in charge of calling people when they stopped doing the program and asking them what was going on. And so I was hearing the reasons that people weren't finding the capacity to do the program that we were asking them to do. And then I've been at Kent State for 11 years. I think I'm at the end of my 11th year now. I'm faculty in the College of Public Health, but I've also worked with the Brain Health Research Institute, the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Center for Teaching and Learning. So I've been working on partnerships with those. So that's a little bit about my professional background. About my personal background, I grew up in Kent, so I'm a native Kentite. This is my family. That was probably when I must have been 3 there because my mom was pregnant with my little brother. My dad's from India, and my mom's from North Carolina, and they met at Kent State. So I had a very interesting childhood in terms of having 2 different cultures. We also went to India a lot when we were growing up. We went almost every winter over the Christmas break. And so a lot of my ideas about the different ways we interact with the world and social justice and equity come from my early experiences with traveling around the world. Let's see, these are my 2 dogs. My partner and I live in Kent now. This Puka's the brown one. Willow is the white and gray one. They're super adorable and a big handful. And so, but they bring a lot of joy to my life. And then the other thing I do is I own a cookie business. It's called Just Add Cookies, and I'm in Kent. And I do custom decorated sugar cookies. And for me, this is a big stress reliever. With all the intellectual things I do in my life, it's really nice to have a creative endeavor where I can really do something that I enjoy. And so the dogs and the cookies are the ways that I refresh my bandwidth in this world. We'll talk about refreshing your bandwidth a little bit um, as we move forward. Okay, so a little bit about me. Now I want to know about you. So in the chat, what I'd like you to do is share the role or the job that brings you to this webinar. And then one interesting thing that makes you feel happy or at peace. So some examples might be, I'm a student, and something that brings me peace is the sound of ocean waves, or I'm a radiology technician and I like the smell of chocolate chip cookies, or I'm the queen of the universe and it's the glimmer of diamonds and moonlight. So in the chat, please share your role and something that makes you feel happy or at peace. Ooh, coloring, that's a good one. I actually do that. Sometimes I'll bring, when I'm teaching a really stressful topic in class, I'll bring coloring sheets and let the students color while I'm talking about something stressful. Gardening's a good one. The soil, apparently, like you get endorphins released just by the smell of the soil. New studies on that. Getting outside, especially right now with the sunshine, I mean, with the snow, I don't know, what is it doing right now? It's Ohio, it could be anything, right? Walking and hiking, right? Movement. If you throw some music in there, there's some new studies on that too, music and movement, how much that can elevate your mood. Traveling. Yes, my parents owned a travel agency my whole childhood, so I used to do a lot of travel. It's been a while. Swimming is a great one too. I love that. You guys are like me. I think we could be friends. Music is great. Um, uh, Crafting. Yes, that's my cookies are my crafting. Um, I have to keep myself away from the craft stores, otherwise I go way crazy. Your pets are wonderful things for helping us feel happy and at peace. One of my dogs is very young still, a year old. He's not a very good cuddler. He's too energetic for that, but the other one's very cuddly. So thank you so much for sharing some of these roles and the things that make you feel peaceful. Hopefully, in our stressful world, you can connect with some of these things. And again, I'm going to talk about refreshing our bandwidth when we close today. And so remember these things because these are things that are important to your brain health. Okay. So our objectives for today, I want you to be able to describe mental bandwidth and what impacts it, how it impacts what we do, like our productivity and our satisfaction, and then a couple of strategies to protect mental bandwidth and increase the things that we want to do with our brain capacity. Okay. So here's some basics on mental bandwidth. What is mental bandwidth? So when I'm talking about mental bandwidth, I'm talking about the amount of controlled processing we have in our brain power. So our brain does lots of processing, like lots of information processing, but a lot of it is automatic, and only some of it is under our direct control. So when I'm talking about mental bandwidth, I'm talking about the part that's under our direct control. So to give you a little perspective, the human brain can process about 11 million bits of information per second. And in case you're not used to thinking in bits, I'll give you something as a comparison. Television is usually about 9 billion bits of information that are being spewed out per second. So human brain processing 11 million bits, so a lot, but not super a lot, right? Because 1 second of television is 9 billion bits, right? And if you think about that, that makes sense, right? When you see 1 second of television, do you actually remember all of the things that were in that second of television? No, we remember a very small piece, right? So our brains can process about 11 million bits per second. So my question for you is, how much of that 11 million bits per second do you think we have conscious control over? So this is our next question. What I want you to do is to put into your poll everywhere your response to how much of our 11 million bits per second of brain processing power do you think we have conscious control over? Do you think it's 50%, 20%, 10%, 2%, or less than 2%? Where do you think we get? How much of that brain processing power do we get to have access to directly? And I'll let a few more people respond. before I show you what people are thinking. A couple people responded in the chat, which is fine. You can also you can respond using the poll everywhere. Okay, let's see what you thought. So it looks like a lot of you think that we have about 20% of our brain power under our conscious control. A good number of you thought 50 or 10%. We hear 10% with about the brain a lot, right? And then a couple of you pessimists thought 2% or less than 2%, right? So let's see what the response is there. We actually have about 0.1% of our brain's processing under our direct control. So our conscious control is about 100 bits per second, right? So we have 11 million bits per second of brain processing, but only about 100 bits per second under our conscious control. So, if you think about it, it's good that our brain does things automatically, right? We want our brain to automatically make our legs move when we walk and to help us breathe, even though we don't think about breathing. And if someone throws something at us, we want to be able to duck even without thinking about it, right? So our brains do a lot automatically, but it's also really important to note we only have about 100 bits per second of conscious controlled processing. So that's about short sentence. Does that sound about right to you guys? About a short sentence a second is all you can actually consciously control in your brain. We all have about that same capacity. I have sometimes had people ask, like, do we have a variety of capacity? We don't really have that wide of a variety of capacity. We're all human beings. We all have about that 100 bits per second, but the availability of that varies widely, right? So we'll talk about what affects the availability of bandwidth. Our bandwidth is extremely important. So this is what we use for learning, for productivity, for innovation. Bandwidth is like what we use to create new neural pathways in our brain. So when we're trying to learn something, we have to create a new neural pathway in our brain. And so bandwidth is required for that. Bandwidth is what we need to control our impulses. So if you can think about the last time you wanted to do something and you stopped yourself from doing it, whether it be eating something or buying something or yelling at the person who's annoying you, if you keep yourself from doing that, it takes bandwidth because our impulse, to control our impulse, takes some of our conscious control of our brain. Patience takes bandwidth. Having creativity, meaningful interactions with other people, all of those require bandwidth. So bandwidth is super important. It also is what helps us to make those nuanced, thoughtful decisions, taking into account many complex aspects of a situation, right? So now that I've told you what I'm talking about when I talk about bandwidth, I'd like to know how many of you have heard about this concept, this perspective of mental bandwidth before. So in the poll everywhere, just put in whether you've never heard of it, you've heard of it, but just a little bit, if you've done trainings or workshops about it before, or if it's something that you know lots about, like you could take over the webinar right now and teach it for me, and then I could go take a nap. If you want, if it's easier to reply in the chat, that's fine. I'm still keeping an eye on that. Okay, I'm seeing some B's in the chat. Looks like our B's are our winner here. A lot of people have heard a little bit about it. Oops. A couple of people have never heard of it. A couple of people have heard of it a good amount. Nobody's ready to take over the webinar though, okay? Okay, we're still on the same page here. Okay, so that helps me. So I kind of have an idea of what we're talking about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit. Let's make sure I'm staying on track here with my time. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what affects the bandwidth availability. Because here's the thing. I told you we have 100 bits per second of bandwidth, mental bandwidth, but we don't actually necessarily have 100 bits per second. We have 100 bits per second for everything. And sometimes things use up our brain. And I'm sure you can understand this and sympathize with this. Sometimes things use up our brain processing that we don't really want them to, right? And so what are some of those things? So a big one is mental and physical health conditions. So physical health conditions, your brain's part of your body. Okay, so if your body's not healthy, your brain's not healthy and your brain doesn't work as well. So if your physical health is suffering, then your brain health is suffering, and then you probably don't have as much of your bandwidth available to you. Mental health conditions also are a really big impact. A lot of people with depression, anxiety, um, they can have hopeless thoughts or worried thoughts, down thoughts. Those kinds of thoughts use up some of your bandwidth, right? So whenever you're conscious, especially of those thoughts, where you feel like things just aren't getting better or things aren't going the way they want, all those things are things that take up our bandwidth. So mental and physical health conditions impact availability. Financial and basic needs security is big. So if you're not able to pay your bills comfortably, like if you're not confident that you can pay your bills, that's a big impact on your mental bandwidth. That actually takes up a lot of bandwidth. There's a whole book about this. It's called Scarcity. And it's about how it's really hard to make good decisions when you're financially not secure, because your so much of your bandwidth gets taken up by your worries about your ability to meet your basic needs. So if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you're not sure about your housing, or you're just living paycheck to paycheck and it's really tough, those things all can take up bandwidth. Having multiple roles. So I know a lot of you are associated with the healthcare fields, and people in healthcare fields often have multiple roles, right? So it's one of those times when 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. Just because you have two roles doesn't mean that it feels like you have double the work. You feel like you have triple the work, right? So whenever you have multiple roles, you have to switch back and forth by putting on different hats, whether that be a student and a parent and a worker, or whether it's, you're a leader and a team member and, um, someone who's in charge of a specific project. All those things can be multiple roles and can take up your bandwidth as well. Belongingness, uncertainty, and marginalization. When we feel like we don't belong, whether that be, a simple situation of walking into a space and feeling like you're kind of the only one there and maybe you're not sure how you belong, those kinds of situations often bring up self-doubt. And self-doubt is another thing that can eat away at our bandwidth. When you're being purposely marginalized, when people are excluding you, it's the same thing. It can bring up thoughts and things that also use up our bandwidth. Constantly changing expectations. And this was, I think we felt this one a lot during the pandemic, like which is what we're supposed to do, how things are supposed to go, changing expectations. Our brains like things to be very predictable. Our brain is there to help us survive. And when things aren't predictable, our brain gets very um, stressed out, right? And our brains spend a lot of our thoughts. So when I'm talking about the pandemic, there were a lot of things in the pandemic that really impacted us. So isolation, right? That's not for most people's nature. Isolation can be very challenging for your brain. Uncertainty, our brains want to be able, again, they want to be able to predict what's next. When things are uncertain, our brains keep trying to predict, even though there's no way to predict what comes next. And so we spend a lot of bandwidth trying to predict what's going to happen next in an uncertain situation. And then loss of routines. I don't think people realize how big of an impact this had on people during the pandemic. Routines are what allow us to put things into the automatic processing. So use that 99.9% of stuff is our routines, right? Have you ever gotten in your car and like driven to the wrong place? Like my car drove to my mom's house. That wasn't where I meant to go. That's your automatic stuff, right? Those are routines. The automatic part of your brain is just doing the stuff that it's supposed to do. Um, and routines are really valuable to us. So having good routines is part of how we keep our bandwidth available to us for the things we want to pay attention to. And we lost a lot of our routines during the pandemic. You couldn't grocery shop the same way. You couldn't get your kids to school the same way. You couldn't, go to work the same way. Everything was different. And so we started having to use our bandwidth for things that usually were automatic. So we had a lot of bandwidth drains in the pandemic. Okay, so what I want to do is do a little activity here. I'm going to make some statements and you're going to indicate how much you agree to them on a scale of 0 to 3, with 0 being that's not you at all and 3 being that's absolutely you. Okay. And what I want you to do is either on your hand or on a piece of paper or whatever works for you is to keep track of how many points you're scoring for each one total as you go along. Okay. So, first one, do you regularly have trouble paying for the basics like rent, food, heat, paying your bills, or making it from paycheck to paycheck? So if that's not you at all, you would give yourself 0 points. If that's you all the time, 3 points. And then in between, So if that's sometimes an issue for you, 1 point, and if it's often an issue for you, 2 points. Okay, so you want to have 0 to 3 points for this statement. Do you regularly have trouble paying for the basics? Okay, next statement. Are you frequently conscious that you are the only one of your identity in a situation? Whatever you see as your identity, do you often feel like you're the only one like you in the situations that you're in? So again, 0 if this isn't you at all, 3 if you feel like this is always you, right? And you're gonna take your score from the first question and your score from your second question, and you're gonna add them together. So for this one, are you frequently conscious that you're the only one of your identity? Okay, next one. On a daily basis, do you have a mental or physical condition or difference that takes up a significant portion of your thoughts or focus? Do you have a mental or physical condition or difference that takes up a lot of your thoughts? 0 for no, 3 for yes, absolutely. And next, do you feel unwelcome or unsafe in your home or work environment? Do you feel unwelcome or unsafe in your home or work environment? Next, are you regularly concerned for your personal well-being or for the well-being and safety of people close to you? So you worry about your own well-being and safety, or the well-being and safety of people that are important to you? Next, are you most often functioning on not enough sleep, a diet that lacks essential vitamins and minerals, and or a generally sedentary lifestyle? So give yourself a point for each one of those you agree with. 0 if you don't agree with any of them. Not enough sleep, a diet that lacks essential vitamins and minerals, or a generally sedentary lifestyle. And then the last one, are you often concerned that what you are doing is not good enough? Again, 0 if that's not you, and 3 if that's something you identify with very strongly. So what I'd like you to do then is to add together your 7 scores, right? So your total score could be anywhere from 0 to 21. Okay. And what I'm going to do next is have a poll everywhere and ask you to put in your range. If you're responding in the chat and you don't want to put down your score, right? The nice thing about poll everywhere is that it's anonymous. So it's up to you. Like if you want to do the poll everywhere anonymous, if you want to put it in the chat, that's fine. But what I'd like to know is what's your total score? What is your bandwidth level right now? Oops. Okay. So it looks like we have a pretty wide range, not a surprise. I often see that in sessions. Um, Not that many people that have a very low score. Decent number, like almost a quarter of you have a score over 12. Um, do you think you can, one of the things to think about is, do you think you can see people's bandwidth level? As someone who teaches undergraduates, um, I can tell you, you can't see bandwidth level. Yeah, and so thank you for the comment there. Yes, if you feel it, and if your score is on the little bit lower side, you can't even imagine what people are dealing with who are at those really high levels, right? I've had students that are at levels that are like 19 out of 21. It's just daunting to think about how little bandwidth they have available to them. You do kind of learn to function like that, but your bandwidth doesn't expand. So you don't actually, you can't make yourself have more bandwidth. You might learn how to have routines around things that are stressful, but there's still things that take your bandwidth, and it makes it harder then for you when you have lower bandwidth. It makes it harder for you to do the things you want to do with your life, to have the meaningful life that you want to have the types of learning and productivity and creativity in your life that you'd like to have. Is harder when your bandwidth is that strained. Right? So what happens when we don't have enough bandwidth, right? So bandwidth is exhaustion is a term that I've talked about through my research, that I've coined as bandwidth exhaustion. And what is bandwidth exhaustion? It's when you regularly don't have the bandwidth for things that you're trying to do. My signs, so my indicator of bandwidth exhaustion is that, so I'll have my day at work and I'll come home and my partner will be like, hey, did you see that Supreme Court decision today? And I'll be like, nope, no, leave me alone. Netflix, Candy Crush, goodbye. Right? Like, just let me sit on the sofa. My brain's done. That's my sign for bandwidth exhaustion, right? It's when we just don't have the bandwidth for the things that we're trying to do. And what happens when you do that, especially when you think you should have the bandwidth, right? So like, as someone who's a faculty member, I often will have work that needs done and I'll think, I just can't do it right now. Right now, I can't sit down and grade these papers. I just don't have the mental capacity to do it. But then I feel like, well, what's wrong with me that I can't just grade some papers? Should it really be that hard? Right? I think what happens then is that you have a series of small failures and invalidations. Like, I don't have the bandwidth for what I'm trying to do. I feel like I should be able to do it. And now there's something wrong with me. What's wrong with me that I don't have the bandwidth to do this thing? Can't I just make myself have the bandwidth? We can't make ourselves have the bandwidth to do stuff. We can cut out other things and prioritize the bandwidth for certain things, but we can't make more bandwidth, right? So when you have these series of small failures and invalidations, the brain perceives a threat, right? Your brain starts to think there's something wrong with me, and your brain sees that as a threat, and it triggers your stress response, your fight, flight, or freeze stress response comes on. There doesn't have to be, right? This was people talk about this as like the response to, man in original times when there's an example, there's a lion coming, right? And so your response is stress response, fight, flight, or freeze, right? But what does it happen when this is a brain thing, not a lion, but a brain threat, right? So it's the same kind of stuff, and it shows up a little bit differently. So this is what I would call the freeze, right? So what happens is you avoid, right? So when we're bandwidth exhausted, our brains trigger the threat response, and what we do is avoid. So excuses, we start ignoring things. Like, I know when my inbox is getting super full, I'm one of those people who tries to take things out of my inbox when I'm done dealing with them. When my inbox gets really full, that's when I know that I'm doing a little avoidance. Or we, just hole up by ourselves. All of those things are things that are ways of freeze, right? Like, we're just not going to deal with the world right now. And that's one response to bandwidth exhaustion. Another response to bandwidth exhaustion is flight, right? How do we escape this? And this can look a lot of different ways, but this is, and I was talking to Jessica about this at the start of the session, it can look like mindless eating, right? Like, we're just going to eat until our brains kind of shut down from that, from the physiological response. It can be substance use, alcohol, or other substances can kind of help us shut our bandwidth off for a little while and escape from the things that we're dealing with. It can be media overload, just Netflix binge. All of those are ways to kind of escape from the bandwidth exhaustion. None of them help it, right? Because it's just postponing it till later, or making it worse. Actually, substance use actually can affect your bandwidth availability. So some of them can actually make it worse, but it's one of the ways we respond to bandwidth exhaustion. And the last one is this kind of the fight response, right? So this is when people get super perfectionistic, very controlling. They have very strong wrong thinking. This is a sign of bandwidth exhaustion. Like, I want to control the things around me. It's like, if people would just put the dishes in the dishwasher the right way, then everything in the world would be fine, right? It's that kind of sense of, I just want to control all of the things around me so that everything is predictable, so that my brain can have a break. And that comes out in a lot of ways. And so people don't often see this as especially perfectionism, unfortunately, has gotten glorified by a lot of our society, but it's not a good, right? It's, how do we control the things around us so that we don't feel so out of control, right? Um, so the long-term consequences of bandwidth exhaustion. One is chronic stress, right? So when our brain is constantly in threat mode, it increases, probably a lot of you know this already, it increases the cortisol levels in our bodies. That eats away at our physical health. Like, our health will deteriorate from having chronic stress, from having too much cortisol response in our body. It reduces our immune response. It makes our digestion worse. It speeds up our heart, can increase our blood sugar. So there are significant health consequences of chronic stress or chronic bandwidth exhaustion. Um, it can make worse other health consequences, like mental health and things like those kind of things. And then also giving up. People just, at some point, people just are like, it's done. I'm done. I can't deal with this anymore. And they give up. Right. So all of these are consequences of bandwidth exhaustion. I wanted to say, I appreciate the people in the chat. I also I have multiple forms of response to bandwidth exhaustion, but the cleaning one can be one that can also be productive, but is still not what we really need in signs when we're bandwidth exhausted. Okay, so what are some of the things? What I want you to just type into the chat, now that we've talked about some of the things that drain bandwidth, what are some of the things that are draining your bandwidth these days? It could be work, could be school, could be your responsibilities, caregiving, could be just the world as it is these days. What are some of the things? Yes, hearing about trauma, work, family, politics, new baby. That's a big one. Yes, that is going to take a lot of bandwidth. Talk about sleep deprivation. Retirement. Okay. Keeping up with things. Yes, the never enough culture, kind of it's always demanding more from us. Work, grief. Yes. Struggling to say no, I think, is really a tough one, right? Again, it's a kind of the culture that we have, the overwork culture. Those are all really good ones, and good ones. Those are all really relevant. I can understand how those things are taking up your bandwidth. I know for me, it's almost the end of the semester. I have a lot of just like, is it over yet? Is it over yet? That takes up my bandwidth, which is, really the result of pushing too hard since fall, right? I pushed really hard from August 20th. And then by the time I get to May, I'm ready to fall over. Can't wait for a couple of months of less demanding work. Decisions can be really exhausting for our bandwidth. Yeah. Good ones here, guys. Okay, so what to do? I'm going to take 5 minutes, tell you about some of the strategies for what can you do about mental bandwidth, and then I will open it up for any questions or thoughts you'd like to share. So what to do? First thing, streamline the bandwidth demands. So is there any way to cut down on the things that take up your bandwidth? Okay. One, you really want to think about, what do you want to use your bandwidth for, and what do you want the people around you to use their bandwidth for, right? How do you want to invest your bandwidth? How do you want to influence other people to invest their bandwidth? So one of the things is to align your bandwidth demands with your objectives. So what are you trying to do? Like, what do you actually want to get done? And are you using your bandwidth for the things that you want to get done? Because we often get stuck in that kind of daily grind where we end up using our bandwidth not for the things. I just saw someone post the other day about their teacher, and they feel like they use all their patience at school during the day, and by the time they get home, they don't have any left for their family. I can completely sympathize with that, right? Patience takes bandwidth, and when we're bandwidth exhausted, we have less patience. So when we don't always keep in mind what the things are we value, we might not save the bandwidth for the things that we want it for. Stop the information overload. Our brains are not designed for the amount of information in the world right now. Like there's so much information generated in the world. So many, I was telling you that like we can process like 11 million bits per second of information in the automatic parts of our brains. Um, it's really amazing and astonishing how much information is out there for us to sort through. If you can cut off some of those sources of information overload, that's good. Maybe you watch too much news, maybe you scroll too much on social media, maybe you take in too many things in the world around you in other ways. You need take a break, take some breaks. It's okay to stop. It's okay to uninstall an app on your phone for a while or stop watching a certain channel for a while. Just stop some of the information overload and give your brain a break. Um, let's see. Discourage multitasking. So, how many of you are good multitaskers? You can raise your hand in the Zoom or type it in the chat. How many people are good multitaskers? How many people know there's no such thing as multitasking? Yeah. So, you can actually do two things with your bandwidth at the same time. You can do two things in your automatic part of your brain, right? Like you can chew and walk or whatever. But you can't do two things with your bandwidth at the same time. So when people are multitasking, whether they're trying or they're being pushed to multitask, what they're really doing is switching back and forth between two tasks really quickly. And every time you switch back and forth between two tasks, you waste a little bit of bandwidth. So when people tell me that they're good multitaskers, what I hear is you're really good at wasting your bandwidth. What we really want to do is try and concentrate on one thing at a time because that's the best for our bandwidth. We can't always do that. In this world, especially, people push us to multitask all the time, right? But it's a good to remember that multitasking is not the most efficient way of using our bandwidth. And so when we can discourage it, we should discourage it, right? We don't want to push people to do more of that. Scaffold things when they're tough. So when you have a tough brain task, try doing it in small pieces. So break things down. When you're working with someone else who might have limited bandwidth, all same thing, scaffold things. So give it to them in small pieces. That helps a lot. Think about if you went to the doctor's office and they asked you to do a medical history and they just gave you a blank piece of paper and said, write down your medical history, right? How much harder is that on your brain than when they give you the form and you just have to like check the little boxes and circle the stuff? It's still no fun. Like you still have to remember this stuff, but how much harder would it be to remember if you didn't have any prompts, right? So those are things that can help our bandwidth. You can do that for yourself too at home in different ways. Okay, so how can you stream bandwidth demands for yourself and others? Think about ways you could stop the information overload, aligning your tasks with objectives, discouraging multitasking, and scaffolding things that are complex. Okay. The next strategy is to reduce the bandwidth drains. So the drains are the things I told you about that steal our bandwidth availability, right? So some of the things we can do is acknowledge the uncertainty. Sometimes it's just important for us to tell our brains, yeah, like I know I don't know what's going to happen next, and that's just where it is, and it's unpleasant, but I can't do anything about it, right? And so acknowledging uncertainty, acknowledging it with other people, like I know you want me to give you an answer, but I don't have an answer right now. And I'm sorry, I know it's tough to not have an answer, but that's where we are. Sometimes just that is enough to take the notch down on how much bandwidth it takes from us. Sorry. Respond with grace and compassion, right? People, you can't see people's bandwidth level. Grace and compassion are incredible ways. If we can take the judgment out of the negative experiences we have, like, oh, I feel like I had a bad day this week and I knew I was having a bad day. Like my mood wasn't in a great place. And I felt bad about having a bad mood. So like the levels of judgment, I just heaped on more bandwidth demands, right? If we can let go some of the judgment, then a lot of the things that we can move forward with we have freer bandwidth, right? So yes, this is not the way that we want it to be, and that's how it is a way to help with bandwidth. Work from an equity-minded strengths-based perspective, right? So when we focus on people's strengths and what they bring to a situation, we can actually do things a lot better, like focusing on what people like and are good at, helps to create more opportunities for the bandwidth to get used well. I'm gonna skip that. Okay, so reducing bandwidth drains, acknowledging uncertainty, responding with grace and compassion, and then working from that equity-minded, strengths-based perspective. The third one is to examine organizational policies and practices. So if you're someone who's a supervisor or you have any charge over what the organizational stuff is going on in the situation around you, thinking about how can you set things up for success. And even in your own household, you could think of as an organization and do this as well. So how do you create conditions for health and well-being? So what do you do to have the most likelihood that you're going to do the things that this is a public health's job, right? How do we create conditions for health and well-being? So what do you want people to do, and have you set them up to be successful for that? So during the pandemic, a good example would be how they moved the hand sanitizer dispensers like in front of you when you walk in the grocery store. There was like a hand sanitizer dispenser right there. So you didn't have to think about it and like go to the corner where they usually keep them. It was like right there in front of you. And so you're much more likely to use it. So that's creating a condition for health or well-being, right? So less bandwidth because you don't have to think about it so much. In your house, it might be like putting your exercise shoes right by the door, right? Might be something, or putting the less healthy foods out of sight and the more healthy things in your sight. Those are all things that help to reduce the amount of bandwidth it takes for you to do the desired behavior. Create patterns that optimize bandwidth. So when are you doing your hard brain work? Like for me, I'm best in the morning. So in the morning, I can do hard brain work, and by the night, not so good at hard brain work. So I do my hard brain work in the morning. So maybe I'm writing a new lecture or grading a really hard set of papers. And then I do the things that are easier on my brain later in the day when I don't have as much bandwidth available. So we can create good patterns there. And this was what I was talking about with the hand sanitizer: create a path of least resistance, path of least brain resistance for desired behavior. So when we want people to do stuff, make it easy for their brain to do it. My students could tell you I could go into that one quite extensively. Okay, so those are some of the ways we have organizational. The last thing I wanted to touch base on is bandwidth self-care. So how do you take care of your own bandwidth? So number one, eat, sleep, breathe, move. Okay, our brain is part of our bodies. We need to take care of our bodies. That means we need to eat nutritious foods, not just anything, eat nutritious foods, sleep an adequate amount, breathe, get oxygen into our bodies. That includes, to me, getting water into your body, but also fresh air, and then move, right? That's how the blood moves around our body to our brains. So eat, sleep, breathe, move. Connect to your values and purpose. When you see the value of something, it takes less bandwidth to do. So I think this is a really interesting piece of this research. When you know why you're doing something and you know that it's important to you. So a good example for me is when I was doing my doctoral degree, and there are times when I'm like, why am I doing this? This is so much work. I don't even know if I want to do this anymore. I would remind myself that what I wanted to do was teach at a university and have a certain quality of life and certain ability to have control over what my workspace and my work life look like. And I needed a doctorate for that. So I would remind myself, I need this because it's going to get me the life that I want. And I was able to move forward through those tasks with less bandwidth demands than if I wasn't connecting to my value. Savor your routines, like get some good routines and enjoy them, right? Routines are good for our brains. They make it so much easier. They reduce the amount of bandwidth, whatever it is, your morning routine, your night routine, your I'm stressed routine, but savor your routines. And then refresh your bandwidth, right? So I told you some of the ways I refresh my bandwidth. Cookies, like the creativity of it, that smells good, it tastes good. Like it's a fun thing. For some of you who talked about getting out in nature or music, all of those things are great ways to refresh your bandwidth. So caring for your own bandwidth, take care of your body, connect to your values, savor your routines, and refresh your bandwidth. Okay, wrapping up, took a little bit longer than I wanted to. Bandwidth is where science meets reality. Like our brain resources are limited. You can't get more, you can't willpower your way into more bandwidth. You only have so much. But running out doesn't mean you're not trying. It just means there are a lot of things taking up your bandwidth. Our brains don't always do what we want them to do. This is not about trying harder, right? It's about recognizing the things that take our bandwidth, seeing if there are ways we can cut some of those out, finding ways to refresh our bandwidth, right? Finding ways we can shape the world around us, to take up less of our bandwidth, right? Cutting off that information overload when we can. Those are the things that are important. So what is one thing you could do right now? You can type it in the chat or not. What's one thing you could do right now to preserve your bandwidth, to help other people's bandwidth, to reduce your bandwidth drains? One thing that you could do based on what we talked about today. One thing you could change, one thing you could do. Taking a walk, absolutely. Movement, fresh air, super good things. Schedule some downtime, yeah. Some really refresh your bandwidth time, right? So it's not just downtime, but it's refresh time. Yeah, stepping away from your computer is good for you. Healthy meals is so important. Getting those vitamins. Now that the weather is getting nicer, we can get fresher foods more easily. Cutting out some of that social media. It's amazing how much bandwidth that can save us. Taking good deep breaths, that's an excellent one. Stepping back from some of the extra responsibilities we only have so much. We have limited capacity. Reminding yourself of your values. Yes, setting some boundaries. I like Brene Brown's research on that the people with the most compassion are the people with the best boundaries, right? When you set boundaries, then you have more bandwidth, and you can do more that way. These are great ones. And then I want to just throw in working on world peace. Just throw that in your extra time. Commit a little bit to working on world peace, because that would help all of our bandwidth, for the world to be a little less bandwidth draining. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much. You can feel free to reach out to me. We can take some questions. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Jessica, do we have a couple minutes? Just barely. But you can definitely reach out to me as well.
Again, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Bhargava, for that very insightful presentation. We do actually have a few minutes for questions and or comments. I know I see a few things actually coming into the chat right now, but feel free, you can utilize the chat and or Q&A function if you would like to share a comment and or inquire a question. I believe there was a question earlier regarding the slides. So yes, we will disseminate the slides to our listserv, and the video recording of today's presentation will also be on the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health YouTube channel. So we will have that up there within a couple of days.
Fantastic.
All right. And then thank you. I do see that you've posted your information, Dr. Bhargava, how they can get in contact with you and or find additional information regarding mental bandwidth. Well, if there are not any further questions, I guess I will close out with some information. If you are interested in obtaining CME CEU credits for today, one last time, that code is 99MIST. That's MIST, and that will actually expire on tomorrow. So tomorrow at 12 p.m. So you want to get in today and complete the evaluation if you are interested in obtaining CMUs. Also, we hope to see you all back right here at May 23rd at 1 p.m. as we welcome Dr. Malika Brown, who will join us to talk about overachievement syndrome, which I think will go very nicely with today's conversation. And then Chris will post some information regarding the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health, our conference that will be coming up on May 18th. We are excited to welcome Dr. Bernice Pesco-Salido. If you're not familiar with her work, she was involved in the You Bring Change to Mind program at Indiana University. And she's also the founding director of the Indiana Consortium of Mental Health Research. She will be our keynote speaker. And Kelly Davis from Mental Health America, who is the Associate Vice President of Peer and Youth Advocacy, will join us as the afternoon plenary. So we are, again, very, very grateful for your information. I actually have a personal list of some of those things that were shared earlier that hopefully I will be able to partake in myself to expand and or reduce some stressors when it comes to mental bandwidth. Thank you again. And thank you everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.